and welcome back to Storytime. So this is going to be the final story time of the Scarlet Pimpernel, and hopefully we won't have any unpleasant surprises like we did at the end of the last story time, although I tried to adjust as much as I possibly could. There were a few that I didn't catch in time, so I apologize about that. Anyways, I was curious about... Oh, hey, Kicking, good to see you. I was curious about the term that they were using to address each other, citoyen, and I kind of had an inkling as to what it would be, but I went ahead and confirmed it. Citoyen means citizen, and so one N at the end, of course, means male citizen. Two N's and an E at the end means a female citizen. It's going all right. It's been, it's been a very weird month so far. I know we're only halfway through. How's it been going with you? Has school started back up for you again? Oh, and I finally fixed the lurk command. So that's now what it says. Yeah, in case you weren't here at the end of last story time, the unfortunate surprise of which I am referring was the whole chapter was extremely anti-Semitic. And I tried to catch... Hi, Diamond Minecrafter, good to see you. I tried to catch as many of the parts where, it was very obvious and adjust it so that it wasn't referring to a race or faith of people, and instead to, like, his profession. Because referring to somebody as a merchant when he is a merchant is perfectly acceptable, I think. Oh, doing online classes. Ooh, nice. Practicing drawing. Very nice. Have you put any of your drawings up on the Discord? And Grounded, I've been wanting to play that. It looks so fun. It's kind of... Have you ever seen the movie Honey, I Shrunk the Kids? It was from the 90s, I believe. Early 90s? Late 80s. I know that, Rick Moranis is sort of the main character. He's one storyline's main character, and then the other storyline is following the kids. But Rick Moranis, who people probably know best from being in what's it called? Ghostbusters. He was Tully, the neighbor of their first client, and he was also in Spaceballs. He was Dark Helmet. It was so funny. Oh, nice anime style. Yeah, I did a bit of anime style as well. I started by drawing like Yu-Gi-Oh type characters. This was, way back in the early aughts. And then I think you saw my manga box. Mostly I just do a kind of mimicking like a certain scene or something like that. How are things with you, Diamond Minecrafter? How's your weekend, or how's your week been so far? Okay. Doing online. I personally think doing online is a very wise decision. One of my coworkers, when school opened back up in late summer, they were given the option of they could do on campus. Hey, Mr. Brightside, good to see you. They were given the option that they could either do continue with online learning, or they could do on campus. And all of the people who chose to do online lucked out because there were outbreaks in the high school. So, yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, you haven't seen it. It's a fun, yeah, Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. So the storyline is, sorry. See, I'm catching up on mouth work. Nice. Well, it's a good, yeah. I think lurking while you do homework is totally cool. Ooh, the last one you have to do today. Nice. That's going to be satisfying. Sorry about that. So, if for people who aren't familiar with Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, the reason why I keep bringing it up when Grounded is mentioned is Wayne Szalinski, I think, is the inventor's name. And, you know, people kind of see him as a loser, but he's really, really smart and he has great ideas. And so he has invented this thing where he can make things shrink or grow, but he hasn't quite gotten it to work yet. Theoretically, it's all there, but, you know. So he gets upset after, like, you know, I don't remember what the upset was. And in his, you know, fit of anger, the machine is just adjusted just enough so that when the kids enter the garage with the two neighbor kids, they get shrunk down to the size of, let's see. Well, let's just say that ants are giant to them. So they're super, super small. And then they are swept into the trash can and thrown out into the yard. And the yard becomes this jungle. And like the ants are giant and the spiders are giant and blades of grass are like skyscrapers to them. So, you know, basically it's Grounded, but without the parent, I guess. Parent story time. Oh, okay, nice. A Kamega kill. So, yeah, anyways, I think I'm going to go, ooh, okay, hang on a second. It's a graphing shapes and stuff thing I'm working on. Now I was reflecting into different parts of the graph, but without a graph to look at. Oh, yeah, that can be tricky. So, like, y-axis, x-axis, z-axis type of thing. Yes, they, yeah. Yeah, Grounded, I think they are a bit bigger than Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. But I would say if you have the ability to watch Honey, I Shrunk, definitely watch that. It'll give you massive Grounded vibes. I just remember there's very distinctly later on in the movie, one of the kids falls into a bowl of Cheerios in milk, and he is like this tiny dot swimming in the donut hole of the Cheerios. Hey, Carell, good to see you. I hope everybody's week has been going well. And you will be happy to see I have fixed the lurk command so it no longer refers to an emote that it doesn't have access to. So there you go. All right, I think I'm gonna no, sorry about that. Well, first off, before I forget, I've decided on the next book. It is going to be Northanger Abbey, which we will start on Sunday. And then after that, we'll be going into Black History Month, and I have picked Frederick Douglass. Of course, he wrote the autobiography of a slave. He wrote a fictional novel called The Heroic Slave, which I will be reading, and then after that, we'll go into some Nellie Bly for Women's History Month. Ooh, yeah. Tea sounds good. I myself, hang on, where is the tea emote? I love the Pride tea emote. Yeah, I think it's Lady Grey that I'm drinking right now. Super delicious stuff. I love, like, the delicate citrus flavors. Really tasty. Oh, and before I forget again, next Monday, if you guys will be around, it's going to be like same time of day when I start, 2 o'clock Pacific time. I'm going to be doing a celebratory stream with Polly Swags, celebrating the streamiversary, because it was 1 year back in January 2nd. Ooh, mint tea. I haven't had mint tea in a while. There's actually like a medley tea that has a couple types of mint. It's called Sweet Dreams, and it's by Bigelow. And I like the mixture of flavors in it. But yeah, anyways, for my streamiversary stream, which is also going to combine, yay, affiliate and 100 plus followers, which that was supposed to happen back in November, but then I lost internet. So it's all going to be like all encompassing. It's going to be next Monday. We're going to be doing some, was it Demon Spire? Or no, Dungeoneering Dungeons in RuneScape. And I chose RuneScape because it is a mega multiplayer online role-playing game. It is free to play, and you can have as many people playing together as you want, which is why I chose that as opposed to, like, you know, Minecraft or Terraria, where, you know, you have a limited amount of room that you can do it. And we're going to be doing super low-level Dungeoneering dungeons, so anybody can join. And Dungeoneering is it's nice because you're not taking anything into the dungeon when you start it. You start out with nothing in your inventory, and you just use the resources that you find in the dungeon at the time, and then you get like rewards at the end. It's a lot of fun. I sometimes have dreams about Dungeoneering dungeons. They're just, yeah, they're super fun. And you can either download the game from RuneScape.com, or you can get it on Steam. And I downloaded it on Steam and just, you know, connected it to my Steam account. But you don't have to have Steam to get it either. So, anyways, if you wanted to join me, everybody's welcome. And Storytime Sun is my avatar's name there. All right, now we're going to go ahead and get started. So we will disappear our Meowing Maestro. And here we go. Chapter 27, On the Track. Never for a moment did Marguerite Blakeney hesitate. The last sounds outside the Chat Gris had died away in the night. She had heard Desgas giving orders to his men, and then starting off towards the fort to get a reinforcement of 12 more men. 6 were not thought sufficient to capture the cunning Englishman, whose resourceful brain was even more dangerous than his valor and his strength. Then, a few minutes later, she heard the merchant's husky voice again, evidently shouting to his nag, then the rumble of wheels and a noise of rickety cart bumping over the rough road. Nag, by the way, is a very old horse. Female, usually, I think. Inside the inn, everything was still. Brogard and his wife, terrified of Chauvelin, had given no sign of life. They hoped to be forgiven, and at any rate to remain unperceived. Marguerite could not even hear their usual volleys of muttered oaths. She waited a moment or two longer. Then she quietly slipped down the broken stairs, wrapped her dark cloak closely round her, and slipped out of the inn. The night was fairly dark, sufficiently so at any rate to hide her dark figure from view, whilst her keen ears kept count of the sound of the cart going on ahead. She hoped by keeping well within the shadow of the ditches, which lined the road, that she would not be seen by Desgas' men when they approached, or by the patrols, which she concluded were still on duty. Thus she started to do this, the last stage of her weary journey, alone at night and on foot. Nearly 3 leagues to Miquelon, and then on to the Père Blanchard's hut, wherever that fatal spot might be, probably over rough roads, she cared not. The merchant's nag could not get on very fast, and though she was weary with mental fatigue and nerve strain, she knew that she could easily keep up with it on a hilly road where the poor beast, who was sure to be half-starved, would have to be allowed long and frequent rests. The road lay some distance from the sea, bordered on either side by shrubs and stunted trees, sparsely covered with meager foliage, all turning away from the north, with their branches looking in the semi-darkness like stiff, ghostly hair blown by a perpetual wind. Fortunately, the moon showed no desire to peep in between the clouds, and Marguerite hugging the edge of the road and keeping close to the low line of shrubs was fairly safe from view. Everything around her was so still. Only from far, very far away, there came like a long, soft moan the sound of the distant sea. The air was keen and full of brine. After that enforced period of inactivity inside the evil-smelling, squalid inn, Marguerite would have enjoyed the sweet scent of this autumnal night and the distant, melancholy rumble of the waves. She would have reveled in the calm and stillness of this lonely spot, a calm broke only at intervals by the strident and mournful cry of some distant gull, by the creaking of the wheels some way down the road. She would have loved the cool atmosphere, the peaceful immensity of nature in this lonely part of the coast. But her heart was too full of cruel foreboding, of a great ache and longing for a being who had become infinitely dear to her. Her feet slipped on the grassy bank, for she thought it safest not to walk near the center of the road, and she found it difficult to keep up a sharp pace along the muddy incline. She even thought it best not to keep too near to the cart. Everything was so still that the rumble of the wheels could not fail to be a safe guide. The loneliness was absolute. Already the few dim lights of Calais lay far behind, and on this road there was not a sign of human habitation, not even the hut of a fisherman or of a woodcutter anywhere near. Far away on her right was the edge of a cliff, below it the rough beach, against which the incoming tide was dashing itself with its constant, distant murmur. Ahead, the rumble of the wheels, bearing an implacable enemy to his triumph. Marguerite wondered at what particular spot on this lonely coast Percy would be at this moment. Not very far, surely, for he had had less than a quarter of an hour's start of Chauvelin. She wondered if he knew that in this cool, ocean-scented bit of France there lurked many spies, all eager to sight his tall figure, to track him to where his unsuspecting friends waited for him, and then to close the net over him and them. Chauvelin, on ahead, jolted and jostled in the merchant's vehicle, was nursing comfortable thoughts. He rubbed his hands together with content as he thought of the web which he had woven, and through which that ubiquitous and daring Englishman could not hope to escape. As the time went on, the old merchant drew him leisurely but surely along the dark road. He felt more and more eager for the grand finale of this exciting chase after the mysterious Scarlet Pimpernel. The capture of the audacious plotter would be the finest leaf in Citoyen Chauvelin's wreath of glory. Caught red-handed on the spot, in the very act of aiding and abetting the traitors against the Republic of France, the Englishman could claim no protection from his own country. Chauvelin had, in any case, fully made up his mind that all intervention should come too soon. Never for a moment did the slightest remorse enter his heart as to the terrible position in which he had placed the unfortunate wife who had unconsciously betrayed her husband. As a matter of fact, Chauvelin had ceased even to think of her. She had been a useful tool, that was all. The merchant's lean nag did little more than walk. She was going along at a slow jog-trot, and her driver had to give her long and frequent halts. "Are we a long way yet from Mykonos?" asked Chauvelin from time to time. Not very far, your honor, was the uniform's placid reply. We have not yet come across your friend and mine, going in a heap in the roadway, was Chauvelin's sarcastic moment. Patience, noble excellency, rejoined the merchant. They are ahead of us. I can see the imprint of the cart's wheels, driven by that traitor, that son of the Amalekite. I don't know what that is. You are sure of the road? Sure as I am of the presence of those 10 gold pieces in the noble excellency's pocket, which I trust will presently be mine. As soon as I have shaken hands with my friend this tall stranger, they will certainly be yours. Hark, what is that? Said the merchant suddenly. Through the stillness, which had been absolute, there could now be heard distinctly the sound of horses' hoofs on the muddy road. They are soldiers, he added in an odd whisper. Stop a moment, I want to hear, said Chauvelin. Marguerite had also heard the sound of galloping hoofs coming towards the cart and towards herself. For some time she had been on the alert, thinking that Desgas and his squad would soon overtake them, but these came from the opposite direction, presumably from Miquelon. The darkness lent her sufficient cover. She had perceived that the cart had stopped, and with utmost caution, treading noiselessly on the soft road, she crept a little nearer. Her heart was beating fast. She was trembling in every limb. Already she had guessed what news these mounted men would bring. Every stranger on these roads on the beach must be shadowed, especially if he be tall or stoops as if he would disguise his height. When sighted, a mounted messenger must at once ride back and report. Those had been Chauvelin's orders. Had then the tall stranger been sighted, and was this the mounted messenger come to bring the great news? That the hunted hare had run its head into the noose at last? Marguerite, realizing that the cart had come to a standstill, managed to slip nearer to it in the darkness. She crept close up, hoping to get within earshot, to hear what the messenger had to say. She heard the quick words of challenge. Liberté, fraternité, égalité. Then Chauvelin's quick query. What news? 2 men on horseback had halted beside the vehicle. Marguerite could see them silhouetted against the midnight sky. She could hear their voices and the snorting of their horses, and now, behind her, some little distance off, the regular and measured tread of a body of advancing men, Desgas and his soldiers. There had been a long pause, during which, no doubt, Chauvelin satisfied the men as to his identity, for presently questions and answers followed each other in quick succession. You have seen the stranger? Asked Chauvelin eagerly. No, citoyen. We have seen no tall stranger. We came by the edge of the cliff. Then? Less than a quarter of a league beyond Miquelon, and we came across the rough construction of wood which looked like the hut of a fisherman, where he might keep his tools and nets. When we first sighted it, it seemed to be empty, and at first we thought that there was nothing suspicious about it, until we saw some smoke issuing through an aperture on the side. I dismounted and crept close to it. It was then empty, but in one corner of the hut there was a charcoal fire, and a couple of stools were also in the hut. I consulted with my comrades, and we decided that they should take cover with the horses well out of sight, and that I should remain on the watch, which I did. Well, and did you see anything? About half an hour later I heard voices, citoyen, and presently 2 men came along towards the edge of the cliff. They seemed to me to have come from the little road. One was young and the other quite old. They were talking in a whisper to one another, and I could not hear what they said. One was young and another quite old. Marguerite's aching heart almost stopped beating as she listened. Was the young one Armand, her brother, and the old one de Tournay? Were they the 2 fugitives who unconsciously were used as a decoy to entrap their fearless and noble rescuer? The 2 men presently came into the hut, continued the soldier, whilst Marguerite's aching nerves seemed to catch the sound of Chauvelin's triumphant chuckle. And I crept nearer to it then. The hut is very roughly built, and I caught snatches of their conversation. Yes? Quick! What did you hear? The old man asked the young one if he were sure that was the right place. Oh, yes, he replied. 'Tis the place sure enough, and by the light of the charcoal fire he showed to his companion a paper which he carried. Here is the plan, he said, which he gave me before I left London. We were to adhere strictly to that plan, unless I had contrary orders, and I have had none. Here is the road we follow. See, here the fork. Here we cut across the St. Martin Road, and here is the footpath which brought us to the edge of the cliff. I must have made a slight noise then, for the young man came to the door of the hut and peered anxiously all round him. When he again joined his companion, they whispered so low that I could no longer hear them. Well, and? Asked Chauvelin impatiently. There were 6 of us altogether patrolling that part of the beach, so we consulted together and thought it best that 4 should remain behind and keep the hut in sight, and I and my comrade rode back at once to make report of what we had seen. You saw nothing of the tall stranger? Nothing, citoyen. If your comrades see him, what will they do? Not lose sight of him for a moment, and if he showed signs of escape, or any boat came in sight, they would close in on him, and, if necessary, they would shoot. The firing would bring the rest of the patrol to the spot. In any case, they would not let the stranger go. Aye, but I did not want the stranger hurt. Not just yet, murmured Chauvelin savagely. But there, you've done your best. The fates grant that I may not be too late. We met half a dozen men just now, who have been patrolling this road for several hours. Well? They have seen no stranger either. Yet he is on ahead somewhere, in a cart or else. Here, there is not a moment to lose. How far is it, that hut, from here? About a couple of leagues, citoyen. You can find it again, at once, without hesitation? I have absolutely no doubt, citoyen. The footpath to the edge of the cliff, even in the dark? It is not a dark night, citoyen, and I know I can find my way, repeated the soldier firmly. Fall in behind, then. Let your comrade take both your horses back to Calais. They won't want them. You won't want them. Keep beside the cart and direct the merchant to drive straight ahead. Then stop him within a quarter of a league of the footpath. See that he takes the most direct road. Whilst Chauvelin spoke, Desgas and his men were fast approaching, and Marguerite could hear their footsteps within 100 yards behind her now. She thought it unsafe to stay where she was, and unnecessarily, too, as she had heard enough. She seemed suddenly to have lost all faculty even for suffering. Her heart, her nerves, her brain seemed to have become numb after all these hours of ceaseless anguish, culminating in this awful despair. For now there was absolutely not the faintest hope. Oh, good! I am glad to hear it. So now you have the rest of the day to do whatever you want. Let's see. For now there was absolutely not the faintest hope. Within 2 short leagues of this spot the fugitives were waiting for their brave deliverer. He was on his way, somewhere on this lonely road, and presently he would join them. Then the well-laid trap would close. 24 men, led by one of those whose hatred was as deadly as his cunning was malicious, would close round the small band of fugitives and their daring leader. They would all be captured. Armand, according to Chauvelin's pledged word, would be restored to her, but her husband, Percy, whom with every breath she drew, she seemed to love and worship more and more, he would fall into the hands of a remorseless enemy who had no pity for a brave heart, no admiration for the courage of a noble soul, who would show nothing but hatred for the cunning antagonist who had baffled him so long. She heard the soldier give a few brief directions to the merchant. Then she retired quickly to the edge of the road and cowered behind some low shrubs, whilst Desgas and his men came up. All fell in noiselessly behind the cart, and slowly they all started down the dark road. Marguerite waited until she reckoned that they were well outside the range of earshot. Then she, too, in the darkness, which suddenly seemed to have become more intense, crept noiselessly along. Chapter 28. The Père Blanchard's Hut. As in a dream, Marguerite followed on. The web was drawing more and more tightly every moment round the beloved life, which had become dearer than all. To see her husband once again, to tell him how she had suffered, how much she had wronged, and how little understood him, had become now her only aim. She had abandoned all hope of saving him. She saw him gradually hemmed in on all sides, and in despair she gazed round her into the darkness and wondered whence he would presently come to fall into the death trap which his relentless enemy had prepared for him. The distant roar of the waves now made her shudder. The occasional dismal cry of an owl or a seagull filled her with unspeakable horror. She thought of the ravenous beasts in human shape who lay in wait for their prey and destroyed them as mercilessly as any hungry wolf for the satisfaction of their own appetite of hate. Marguerite was not afraid of the darkness. She only feared that man on ahead who was sitting on the bottom of a rough wooden cart, nursing thoughts of vengeance which would have made the very demons in hell chuckle with delight. Her feet were sore, her knees shook under her from sheer bodily fatigue. For days now she had lived in a wild turmoil of excitement. She had not had a quiet rest for 3 nights. Now she had walked on a slippery road for nearly 2 hours, and yet her determination never swerved for a moment. She would see her husband, tell him all, and, if he was ready to forgive the crime which she had committed in her blind ignorance, she would yet have the happiness of dying by his side. She must have walked on almost in a trance, instinct alone keeping her up and guiding her to the wake of the enemy, and suddenly her ears, attuned to the slightest sound by that same blind instinct, told her that the cart had stopped and that the soldiers had halted. They had come to their destination. No doubt on the right, somewhere close ahead, was the footpath that led to the edge of the cliff and to the hut. Heedless of any risks, she crept quite close up to where Chauvelin stood, surrounded by his little troop. He had descended from the cart and was giving more orders to the men. These she wanted to hear. What little chance she yet had of being useful to Percy consisted in hearing absolutely every word of his enemy's plans. The spot where all the party had halted must have lain some 800 meters from the coast. The sound of the sea came only very faintly, as from a distance. Chauvelin and Desgas, followed by the soldiers, had turned off sharply to the right of the road, apparently on the footpath which led to the cliffs. The merchant had remained on the road with his cart and nag. Marguerite, with infinite caution and literally crawling on her hands and knees, had almost turned off to the right. To accomplish this, she had to creep through the rough, low shrubs, trying to make as little noise as possible as she went along, tearing her face and hands against the dry twigs, intent only upon hearing without being seen or heard. Fortunately, as is usual in this part of France, the footpath was bordered by a low, rough hedge, beyond which was a dry ditch filled with coarse grass. In this Marguerite managed to find shelter. She was quite hidden from view, yet could contrive to get within 3 yards of where Chauvelin stood, giving orders to his men. "Now," he was saying in a low and peremptory whisper, "where is the Père Blanchard's hut?" "About 800 meters from here, along the footpath," said the soldier who had lately been directing the party, "and halfway down the cliff." "Very good. You shall lead us. Before we begin to descend the cliff, You shall creep down to the hut as noiselessly as possible and ascertain if the traitor royalists are there. Do you understand? I understand, citoyenne. Now listen very attentively. All of you, commanded Chauvelin impressively, and addressing the soldiers collectively. For after this we may not be able to exchange another word, so remember every syllable I utter, as if your very lives depended on your memory. Perhaps they do, he added dryly. You listen, citoyenne, said Desgas, and a soldier of the Republic never forgets an order. You, who have crept up to the hut, will try to peep inside. If an Englishman is there with those traitors, a man who is tall above the average, or who stoops as if he would disguise his height, then give a sharp, quick whistle as a signal to your comrades. All of you, he added, once more speaking to the soldiers collectively, then quickly surround and rush into the hut, and each side... Oh, thank you so much, Diamond Minecrafter. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Then quickly surround and rush into the hut, and each seize one of the men there before they have time to draw their firearms. If any of them struggle, shoot at their legs or arms. But on no account kill the tall man. Do you understand? You understand, citoyenne? The man who is tall above the average is probably also strong above the average. It will take 4 or 5 of you at least to overpower him. Oh, thank you for the reminder to hydrate. I shall. Hydration is a very important thing during storytime streams. Delicious. Let's see. There was a little pause. Then Chauvelin continued. If the royalist traitors are still alone, which is more than likely to be the case, then warn your comrades who are lying in wait there. And all of you creep and take cover behind the rocks and boulders round the hut, and wait there in dead silence until the tall Englishman arrives. Then only rush the hut when he is safely within its doors, but remember that you must be as silent as the wolf is at night when he prowls round the pens. I do not wish those royalists to be on the alert. The firing of a pistol, a shriek or call on their part would be sufficient, perhaps, to warn the tall personage to keep clear of the cliffs and of the hut, and, he added emphatically, it is the tall Englishman whom it is your duty to capture tonight. You shall be implicitly obeyed, citoyenne. Then get along as noiselessly as possible, and I will follow you. What about the merchant, citoyenne? Asked Desgas silently, like noiseless shadows, one by one. The soldiers began to creep along the rough and narrow footpath. Oh, yes, I'd forgotten about the merchant, said Chauvelin, and turning towards the merchant, he called him peremptorily. Here, you, whatever your confounded name may be, he said to the old man, who had quietly stood beside his lean nag, as far away from the soldiers as possible. Benjamin Rosenbaum, so please your honor, he replied humbly. It does not please me to hear your voice, but it does please me to give you certain orders, which you will find it wise to obey. So please your honor. Hold your confounded tongue. You shall stay here, do you hear, with your horse and cart until our return. You are on no account to utter the faintest sound, or to even breathe louder than you can help. Nor are you, on any consideration whatsoever, to leave your post until I give you orders to do so. Do you understand? But your honor, protested the merchant pitiably. There is no question of or of any argument, said Chauvelin, in a tone that made the timid old man tremble from head to foot. If, when I return, I do not find you here, I most solemnly assure you that wherever you may try to hide yourself, I can find you, and that punishment, swift, sure, and terrible, will sooner or later overtake you. Do you hear me? But, your excellency, I said, do you hear me? The soldiers had all crept away. The 3 men stood alone together in the dark and lonely road, with Marguerite there, behind the hedge, listening to Chauvelin's orders, as he as she would to her own death sentence. "I hear your honor," protested the merchant again, while he tried to draw nearer to Chauvelin, "and I swear that I would obey—" hang on a second. Pages stuck together. "And I swear that I would obey your honor most absolutely, and that I would not move from this place until your honor once more deigned to shed the light of your countenance upon your humble servant. But remember, your honor, if I am a poor old man, my nerves are not as strong as those of a young soldier. If midnight marauders should come prowling round this lonely road, I might scream or run in my fright. And is my life to be forfeit? Is some terrible punishment to come on my poor old head for that which I cannot help?" The merchant seemed in real distress. He was shaking from head to foot. Clearly he was not the man to be left by himself on this lonely road. The man spoke truly. He might unwittingly, in sheer terror, utter the shriek that might prove a warning to the wily Scarlet Pimpernel. Chauvelin reflected for a moment. "Will your horse and cart be safe alone here, do you think?" he asked roughly. "I fancy, citoyen," here interposed Desgas, "that they will be safer without that dirty, cowardly merchant than with him. There seems no doubt that, if he gets scared, he will either make a bolt for it or shriek his head off. But what am I to do with the brute? Will you send him back to Calais, citoyen?" "No, for we shall want him to drive back the wounded presently," said Chauvelin with grim significance. There was a pause again. Desgas waited for the decision of his chief, and the old merchant whining beside his nag. "Well, you lazy, lumbering old coward," said Chauvelin at last, "you would better shuffle along behind us. Here, citoyen Desgas, tie this handkerchief tightly round the fellow's mouth." Chauvelin handed a scarf to Desgas, who solemnly began winding it around the merchant's mouth. Meekly, Benjamin Rosenbaum allowed himself to be gagged. He evidently preferred this uncomfortable state to that of being left alone on the dark St. Martin road. Then the three men fell in line. "Quick," said Chauvelin impatiently. "We have already wasted much valuable time." And the firm footsteps of Chauvelin and Desgas, the shuffling gait of the old merchant, soon died away along the footpath. Marguerite had not lost a single one of Chauvelin's words of command. Every nerve was strained to completely grasp the situation first, then to make a final appeal to those wits which had so often been called the sharpest in Europe, and which alone might be of service now. Certainly the situation was desperate enough. A tiny band of unsuspecting men quietly awaiting the arrival of their rescuer, who was equally unconscious of the trap laid for them all. It seemed so horrible, this net, as it were drawn in a circle at dead of night on a lonely beach, round a few defenseless men, defenseless because they were tricked and unsuspecting. Of these, one was the husband she idolized, another the brother she loved. She vaguely wondered who the others were, who were also calmly waiting for the Scarlet Pimpernel, while death lurked behind every boulder of the cliffs. For the moment she could do nothing but follow the soldiers and Chauvelin. She feared to lose her way, or she would have rushed forward and found that wooden hut, and perhaps been in time to warn the fugitives and their brave deliverer yet. For a second the thought flashed through her mind of uttering the piercing shrieks which Chauvelin seemed to dread as a possible warning to the Scarlet Pimpernel and his friends, in the wild hope that they would hear and have yet time to escape before it was too late. But she did not know how far from the edge of the cliff she was. She did not know She did not know if her shrieks would reach the ears of the doomed men. They forgot a K there. Her efforts might be premature, and she would never be allowed to make another. Her mouth would be securely gagged, like that of the merchant, and she, a helpless prisoner in the hands of Chauvelin's men. Like a ghost she flitted noiselessly behind that hedge. She had taken her shoes off, and her stockings were by now torn off her feet. She felt neither soreness nor weariness. indomitable will to reach her husband in spite of adverse fate, and of a cunning enemy, killed all sense of bodily pain within her, and rendered her instincts doubly acute. She heard nothing save the soft and measured footsteps of Percy's enemies on in front. She saw nothing but, in her mind's eye, that wooden hut, and he, her husband, walking blindly to his doom. Suddenly, those same keen instincts within her made her pause in her mad haste, and cower still further within the shadow of the hedge. The moon, which had proved a friend to her by remaining hidden behind the banks of clouds, now emerged in all the glory of an elderly autumn night, and in a moment flooded the weird and lonely landscape with a rush of brilliant light. There, not 200 meters ahead, was the edge of the cliff, and below, stretching far away to free and happy England, the sea rolled on smoothly and peacefully. Marguerite's gaze rested for a moment on the brilliant silvery waters, and as she gazed, her heart, which had been numb with pain for all these hours, seemed to soften and distend, and her eyes filled with hot tears. Not 3 miles away, with white sails yet, a graceful schooner lay in wait. Marguerite had guessed rather than recognized her. It was the Daydream, Percy's favorite yacht, with old Briggs, that prince of skippers aboard, and all her crew of British sailors. Her white sails, glistening in the moonlight, seemed to convey a message to Marguerite of joy and hope, which yet she feared could never be. She waited there out at sea, waited for her master like a beautiful white bird all ready to take flight, and he would never reach her, never see her smooth deck again, never gaze any more on the white cliffs of England and the land of liberty and of hope. The sight of the schooner seemed to infuse into the poor, wearied woman the superhuman strength of despair. There was the edge of the cliff, and some way below was the hut where presently her husband would meet his death. But the moon was out. She could see her way now. She would see the hut from a distance, run to it, rouse them all, warn them at any rate to be prepared and to sell their lives dearly, rather than be caught like so many rats in a hole. She stumbled on behind the hedge in the low, thick grass of the ditch. She must have run on very fast, and had outdistanced Chauvelin and Desgas, for presently she reached the edge of the cliff and heard their footsteps distinctly behind her. But only a few yards away, and now the moonlight was full upon her. Her figure must have been distinctly silhouetted against the silvery background of the sea. Only for a moment, though. The next she had cowered, like some animal doubled up within itself. She peeped down the great rugged cliffs. The descent would be easy enough, as they were not precipitous, and the great boulders afforded plenty of footholds. Suddenly, as she gazed, she saw at some little distance on her left, and about midway down the cliffs, a rough wooden construction through the walls of which a tiny red light glimmered like a beacon. Her very heart seemed to stand still. The eagerness of joy was so great that it felt like an awful pain. She could not gauge how distant the hut was, but without hesitation she began the steep descent, creeping from boulder to boulder, caring nothing for the enemy behind or for the enemies, who evidently had all taken cover since the tall Englishman had not yet appeared. As she pressed, forgetting the deadly foe on her track, running, stumbling, footsore, half-dazed, but still on, when suddenly a crevice or stone or slippery bit of rock threw her violently to the ground. She struggled again to her feet and started running forward once more to give them that timely warning, to beg them to flee before he came, and to tell him to keep away, away from this death-trap, away from this awful doom. But now she realized that other steps, quicker than her own, were already close at her heels. The next instant a hand dragged at her skirt, and she was down on her knees again, whilst something was wound round her mouth to prevent her uttering a scream. Bewildered, half frantic with the bitterness of disappointment, She looked round her helplessly, and, bending down quite close to her, she saw through the mist which seemed to gather round her a pair of keen, malicious eyes, which appeared to her excited brain to have a weird, supernatural green light in them. She lay in the shadows of a great boulder. Chauvelin could not see her features, but he passed his thin, white fingers over her face. "Woman," he whispered, "by all the saints in the calendar!" "We cannot let her loose, that's certain," he muttered to himself. "I wonder now." Suddenly he paused, and after a few seconds of deadly silence, he gave forth a long, low, curious chuckle, which once again Marguerite felt with a horrible shudder, his thin fingers wandering over her face. Dear me," he whispered with affected gallantry, "this is indeed a charming surprise." And Marguerite felt her resistless hand raising to Chauvelin's thick, mocking lips. The situation was indeed grotesque. Had it not been at the same time so fearfully tragic, the poor weary woman, broken in spirit and half tragic. "Oh, yes, I am okay. Good to see you. I'm glad you can make it. Enjoy your lurk." The situation was indeed grotesque, had it not been at the same time so fearfully tragic. The poor, weary woman, broken in spirit, and half frantic with the bitterness of her disappointment, receiving on her knees the banal gallantries of her deadly enemy. By the way, I finally fixed the lurk command. Her senses were leaving her, half choked with the tight grip round her mouth. She had no strength to move or to utter the faintest sound. The excitement which all along had kept up her delicate body seemed at once to have subsided, and the feeling of blank despair to have completely paralyzed her brain and nerves. Chauvelin must have given some directions, which she was too dazed to hear, for she felt for herself lifted from off her feet. The bandage round her mouth was made more secure, and a pair of strong arms carried her towards that tiny red light on ahead which she had looked upon as a beacon and the last faint glimmer of hope. So this is my new lurk command. Just wanted to show that to you. Taking just a tiny chapter break. I hope you're having a good morning, UK. And you as well, Mr. Brightside. Oh, thank you so much for the follow, Owl. Since I'm at a chapter break, I can do my little introduction. My name is Sunny, of course, as the name indicates. Let me just post this up. These are my socials. I have a Discord where, very important Discord channel, the Pet Pictures, and you can put up art and like recipes, music, games, all of that stuff. Oh, okay. Well, Storytime's the perfect place to relax. So I hope you're having a good relaxation. Anyways, yes. So I do mostly Storytime streaming. They are all public domain books, so that means they're about 100 plus years old. And usually I don't chat while I'm in the middle of a chapter, but I'm in a chapter break, so that's fine. And then I also do some game streams. I usually do that like after my Storytime streams. And right here, I put up all of my my Storytime streams so that, if you come in the middle of a story, you can go back and catch up, or you can listen at your leisure. And they're all in playlist form, so you don't have to worry about finding the next video. So how has your day been going, Owl? Your week as well? And do you do any streaming yourself? Oh, thank you very much. You're welcome. Thank you, and you're welcome. Oh, that's good. I'm glad to hear it. So, do you like to do any gaming, or do you do any streaming? You might, yeah. I didn't, when I started watching live streams, I didn't think that I would ever stream myself. And I actually, because I have for about 25 years read aloud, I started reading aloud to my cats. And I just, like, I love doing it. But I had never thought of doing that, like, online. So it was Christmas Eve of 2019 when I came up with the idea, and January 2nd I started doing it. And I've been having a lot of fun, meeting a lot of great people. Once I got my new computer, I started doing some game streams. And, you don't have to be good at gaming to do a game stream, and there are plenty of other, plenty of types of games. You can just have fun. So, what sort of books do you enjoy? Yeah, thank you. By the way, I am going to be doing a streamiversary stream next Monday, and it's going to be starting at the same time, 2 Pacific, and I'm going to be doing some RuneScape, which is a free-to-play MMORPG. Going to be doing some dungeoneering dungeons with people, and very low level, so I mean you can just start playing, or you can do a little bit. I've been doing some skills prepping and stuff like that for the game and for the stream. So if you wanted to join us, you are free to. And this is let's see, this is my avatar's name. Oh yes, Haunting of Hill House. That's such a good one. Have you ever seen the original movie? It was back in the 60s, I believe, with Russ Tamblyn was in it. He's the only name that I can really remember. But it's so fun. It doesn't rely on like gore and jump scares and all of that stuff, but it's so creepy and insidious and fun. My sister and I sometimes quote the movie in the night, in the dark. Sadly, that's not public domain, so I can't do that for Storytime yet. But I do have some creepy ones to look forward to. Yes, definitely do. Don't bother with the 1999 one. It's I was so disappointed in it. But yes, the 1960s one is a lot of fun. Definitely check it out. I'm actually going to be reading. It's sort of a parody on Gothic horrors. My next story time is going to be Northanger Abbey, which is by Jane Austen, and she's very snarky in it. I love her attitude in it, and it's supposed to be like this woman who is the storyline is this woman, the main character, is obsessed with Gothic horrors, and she thinks she's going to find it around every corner. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. Also, I wanted to share with you the upcoming story times after Northanger Abbey. In February, since in the U.S. it is Black History Month, Frederick Douglass, who wrote the autobiography of a slave, he did write a novel. It is a short one, but I am very intrigued by it. It's called The Heroic Slave, and I'll be reading that one. And then following that, if you're not familiar with Nellie Bly, she was back in the late 1800s a reporter for a newspaper, and she did a pretty groundbreaking one where she put herself into an institution for about 8 days, I believe, like an insane asylum. And she just wanted to see how people were treated there. And then she wrote these articles in the newspaper about it. That was her real big groundbreaker. She also wrote a series of articles where she traveled around the United States, not the United States, around the world. She was inspired by Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, and she wanted to see if she could break his record. So she just started traveling around the world. She'd send in articles, and then meanwhile, back in the States, another newspaper was like, hey, we have a female reporter. We could send her also around the world and see if she can beat Nellie Bly. And so it went from being a race against Jules Verne to a race against the other female reporter, and I am blanking on her name. But anyways, I'm going to be reading that serialization of articles, and I've never read them before. I'm very intrigued, and that's going to be for Women's History Month. I also have a mystery that she serialized in the paper called, The Mystery of Central Park. So that's what's coming up in the next couple of months. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and when you see this little guy right here, this is Maestro. By the way, I didn't introduce my kitties. Those are my two cats. You'll see them in my art and stuff. Anyways, I'm going to hide my meowing Maestro, and we'll go ahead and continue. Chapter 29, Trapped. She did not know how long she was thus carried along. She had lost all notion of time and space, and for a few seconds tired nature mercifully deprived her of consciousness. When she once more realized her state, she felt that she was placed with some degree of comfort upon a man's coat, with her back resting against a fragment of rock. The moon was hidden again behind some clouds, and the darkness seemed in comparison more intense. The sea was roaring some 200 feet below her, and on looking all round she could no longer see any vestige of the tiny glimmer of red light. That the end of the journey had been reached, she gathered from the fact that she heard rapid questions and answers spoken in a whisper quite close to her. There are 4 men in there, citoyenne. They are sitting by the fire, and they seem to be waiting quietly. The hour? Nearly 2 o'clock. Citoyenne, by the way, is French for citizen. The tide? Coming quickly. The schooner? Obviously an English one, lying some 3 kilometers out, but we cannot see her boat. Have the men taken cover? Yes, citoyenne. They will not blunder? They will not stir until the tall Englishman comes. Then they will surround and overpower the 5 men. Right, and the lady? Still dazed, I fancy. She's close behind you, citoyenne. And the merchant? He's gagged and his legs strapped together. He cannot move or scream. Good. Then have your gun ready in case you want it. Get close to the hut and leave me to look after the lady. Desgas evidently obeyed, for Marguerite heard him creeping away along the stony cliff. Then she felt that a pair of warm, thin, talon-like hands took hold of both her own and held them in a grip of steel. Before that handkerchief is removed from your pretty mouth, fair lady, whispered Chauvelin close to her ear, I think it right to give you one small word of warning. What has procured me the honor of being followed across the channel by so charming a companion, I cannot, of course, conceive, but if I mistake not, the purpose of this flattering attention is not one that would commend itself to my vanity, and I think that I am right in surmising, moreover, that the first sound which your pretty lips would utter, as soon as the cruel gag is removed, would be one that would perhaps prove a warning to the cunning fox which I have been at such pains to track to this lair." He paused a moment, while the steel-like grasp seemed to tighten round her wrist. Then he resumed in the same hurried whisper, "Inside that hut, if again I am not mistaken, your brother Armand St. Just waits with that traitor de Tournay and 2 other men unknown to you for the arrival of the mysterious rescuer whose identity has for so long puzzled our Committee of Public Safety, the audacious Scarlet Pimpernel. No doubt if you scream, if there is a scuffle here, if shots are fired, it is more than likely that the same long legs that brought his scarlet enigma here will as quickly take him to some place of safety. The purpose, then, for which I have traveled all these miles will remain unaccomplished. On the other hand, it only rests with yourself that your brother, Armand, shall be free to go off with you tonight, if you like, to England, or any other place of safety." Marguerite could not utter a sound, as the handkerchief was wound very tightly round her mouth. But Chauvelin was peering through the darkness very closely into her face, no doubt to her hand gave a responsive appeal to his last suggestion, for presently he continued, "What I want you to do to ensure Armand's safety is a very simple thing, dear lady." "What is it?" Marguerite's hand seemed to convey to his in response. "To remain on this spot without uttering a sound until I give you leave to speak. Oh, but I think you will obey," he added with that funny dry chuckle of his, as Marguerite's whole figure seemed to stiffen in defiance of his order. "For let me tell you that if you scream, nay, if you utter one sound or attempt to move from here, my men, there are 30 of them about, will seize St. Just, de Tournay, and their 2 friends, and shoot them here, by my orders, before your eyes." Marguerite had listened to her implacable enemy's speech with ever-increasing terror. Numbed with physical pain, she yet had sufficient mental vitality in her to realize the full horror of this terrible either-or. He was once more putting before her either-or 10,000 times more appalling and horrible than the one he had suggested to her that fatal night at the ball. This time it meant that she should keep still and allow the husband she worshipped to walk unconsciously to his death, or that she should, by trying to give him a word of warning, which perhaps might even be unavailing, actually give the signal for her own brother's death and that of 3 other unsuspecting men. She could not see Chauvelin, but she could almost feel those keen, pale eyes of his fixed maliciously upon her helpless form. And his hurried, whispered words reached her ear, as the death knell of her last faint, lingering hope. "Nay, fair lady," he added urbanely, "you can have no interest in any one save St. Just, and all you need do for his safety is to remain where you are and to keep silent. My men have strict orders to spare him in every way. As for that enigmatic Scarlet Pimpernel, what is he to you? Believe me, no warning from you could possibly save him. And now, dear lady, let me remove this unpleasant coercion which has been placed before your pretty mouth. You see, I wish you to be perfectly free in the choice which you are about to make." Her thoughts in a whirl, her temples aching, her nerves paralyzed, her body numb with pain, Marguerite sat there in the darkness which surrounded her as with a pall. From where she sat she could not see the sea, but she heard the incessant mournful murmur of the incoming tide, which spoke of her dead hopes, her lost love, the husband she had with her own hand betrayed and sent to his death. Chauvelin removed the handkerchief from her mouth. She certainly did not scream. At that moment she had no strength to do anything but barely to hold herself upright and to force herself to think. Oh, think of what she should do. The minutes flew on. In this awful stillness she could not tell how fast or how slowly. She heard nothing. She saw nothing. She did not feel the sweet-smelling autumn air, scented with the briny odor of the sea. She no longer heard the murmur of the waves, the occasional rattling of a pebble as it rolled down some steep incline. More and more unreal did the whole situation seem. It was impossible that she, Marguerite Blakeney, the Queen of London society, should actually be sitting here on this bit of lonely coast, in the middle of the night, side by side with the most bitter enemy. And it was not possible that somewhere, not many 100 feet away perhaps from where she stood, the being she had once despised, but who now, in every moment of this weird, dreamlike life, became more and more dear. It was not possible that he was unconsciously, even now, walking to his doom, whilst she did nothing to save him. Why did she not, with unearthly screams that would re-echo from one end of the lonely beach to the other, send out a warning to him to desist, to retrace his steps? Her death lurked here whilst he advanced. Once or twice the screams rose to her throat, as if by instinct. Then, before her eyes, there stood the awful alternative. Her brother and those 3 men shot before her eyes, practically by her orders. She their murderer. Oh, that fiend in human shape next to her knew human, female nature well. He had played upon her feelings as a skillful musician plays upon an instrument. He had gauged her very thoughts to a nicety. She could not give that signal, for she was weak, and she was a woman. How could she deliberately order Armand to be shot before her eyes, to have his clear blood upon her head, he dying perhaps with a curse on her, upon his lips? And little Suzanne's father, too, he an old man, and the others, it was all too horrible. Wait. How long? The early morning hours sped on, and yet it was not dawn. The sea continued its incessant mournful murmur. The autumnal breeze sighed gently in the night. The lonely beach was silent, even as the grave. Suddenly, from somewhere not very far away, a cheerful, strong voice was heard singing, "God Save the King." Chapter 30. The Schooner. Marguerite's aching heart stood still. She felt more than she heard, the men on the watch preparing for the fight. Her senses told her that each, with sword in hand, was crouching, ready for the spring. The voice came nearer and nearer, in the vast immensity of these lonely cliffs, with the loud murmur of the sea below. It was impossible to say how near or how far, nor yet from which direction came that cheerful singer who sang to God to save his king, whilst he himself was in such deadly danger. Faint at first, the voice grew louder and louder. From time to time a small pebble detached itself apparently from beneath the firm tread of the singer, and went rolling down the rocky cliffs to the beach below. Marguerite, as she heard, felt that her very life was slipping away, as if when that voice drew nearer, when that singer became entrapped. She distinctly heard the click of Desgas' gun close to her. No. Oh, God in heaven, this cannot be. Let Armand's blood then be upon her own head. Let her be branded as his murderer. Let even he whom she loved despise and loathe her for this. But God, oh God, save him at any cost. With a wild shriek, she sprang to her feet and darted round the rock against which she had been cowering. She saw the little red gleam through the chinks of the hut. She ran up to it and fell against its wooden walls, which she began to hammer with clenched fists in its almost maniacal frenzy, while she shouted, "Armand! Armand, for God's sake, fire! Your leader is near. He is coming. He is betrayed. Armand! Armand! Fire in heaven's name!" She was seized and thrown to the ground. She lay there moaning, bruised, not caring, but still half sobbing, half shrieking. "Percy, my husband, for God's sake, Fly! Armand! Armand, why don't you fire? One of you stop that woman screaming, hissed Chauvelin, who hardly could refrain from striking her. Something was thrown over her face. She could not breathe, and perforce she was silenced. The bold singer, too, had become silent, warned, no doubt, for his impending danger, by Marguerite's frantic shrieks. The men who sprung to their feet, there was no need for further silence on their part. The very cliffs echoed the poor, heartbroken woman's screams. Chauvelin, with a muttered oath which boded no good to her, who had dared to upset his most cherished plans, had hastily shouted the word of command. "Into it, my men, and let no one escape from that hut alive!" The moon had once more emerged from between the clouds. Darkness on the cliffs had gone, giving place once more to brilliant silvery light. Some of the soldiers had rushed to the rough wooden door of the hut, whilst one of them kept guard over Marguerite. The door was partially open. One of the soldiers pushed it further, but within all was darkness. The charcoal fire only lighted with a dim red light the furthest corner of the hut. The soldiers paused automatically at the door, like machines waiting for further orders. Chauvelin, who was prepared for a violent onslaught from within, and for a vigorous resistance from the four fugitives under cover of the darkness, was for the moment paralyzed with astonishment when he saw that the soldiers standing there at attention, like sentries on guard, whilst not a sound proceeded from the hut. Filled with strange, anxious foreboding, he, too, went to the door of the hut, and peering into the gloom, he asked quickly, "What is the meaning of this?" "I think, citoyen, that there is no one there now," replied one of the soldiers imperturbably. "You have not let those 4 men go," thundered Chauvelin menacingly. "I ordered you to let no man escape alive. Quick, after them, all of you. Quick, in every direction." The men, obedient as machines, rushed down the rocky incline towards the beach, some going off to right and left, as fast as their feet could carry them. "You and your men will pay with your lives for this blunder, citoyen sergeant," said Chauvelin viciously to the sergeant who had been in charge of the men. "And you too, citoyen," he added, turning with a snarl to Desgas, "for disobeying my orders." "You ordered us to wait, citoyen, until the tall Englishman arrived and joined the 4 men in the hut. No one came," said the sergeant sullenly. "But I ordered you just now, when the woman screamed, to rush in and let no one escape." "But, citoyen, the 4 men who were there before had been gone some time, I think." "You think? You?" said Chauvelin, almost choking with fury. "And you let them go." "You ordered us to wait, citoyen," protested the sergeant, "and to implicitly obey your commands upon pain of death. We've waited." "I heard the men creep out of the hut not many minutes after we took cover, and long before the woman screamed," he added, as Chauvelin seemed still quite speechless with rage. "Hark!" said Desgas suddenly. In the distance the sound of repeating firing was heard. Chauvelin tried to peer along the beach below, but as luck would have it, the fitful moon once more hid her light behind a bank of clouds, and he could see nothing. "One of you go into the hut and strike a light," he stammered at last. Stolidly the sergeant obeyed. He went up to the charcoal fire and lit the small lantern he carried in his belt. It was evident that the hut was quite empty. "Which way did they go?" asked Chauvelin. "I could not tell, citoyen," said the sergeant. "They went straight down the cliff first, then disappeared behind some boulders." "Hush! What was that?" All 3 men listened attentively. In the far, very far distance could be heard faintly echoing and already dying away the quick, sharp splash of half a dozen oars. Chauvelin took out his handkerchief and wiped the perspiration from his forehead. "The schooner's boat," was all he gasped. Evidently Armand St-Just and his 3 companions had managed to creep along the side of the cliffs, whilst the men, like true soldiers of the well-drilled Republican army, had with blind obedience and in fear of their lives implicitly obeyed Chauvelin's orders to wait for the tall Englishman, who was the important capture. They had no doubt reached one of the creeks, which jut far out to sea on this coast at intervals. Behind this, the boat of the Daydream must have been on the lookout for them, and they were by now safely on board the British schooner. As if to confirm this last supposition, the dull boom of a gun was heard from out at sea. "The schooner, citoyenne," said Desgas quietly. "She's off." It needed all Chauvelin's nerves and presence of mind not to give way to a useless and undignified access of rage. There was no doubt now that once again that accursed British head had completely outwitted him. How he had contrived to reach the hut without being seen by one of the 30 soldiers who guarded the spot was more than Chauvelin could conceive. That he had done so before the 30 men had arrived on the cliff was, of course, fairly clear, but how he had come over in Reuben Goldstein's cart all the way from Calais without being sighted by the various patrols on duty was impossible of explanation. It really seemed as if some potent fate watched over that daring Scarlet Pimpernel, and his astute enemy almost felt a superstitious shudder pass through him as he looked round at the towering cliffs and the loneliness of this outlying coast. But surely this was reality in the year of grace 1792. There were no fairies and hobgoblins about. Chauvelin and his 30 men had all heard with their own ears that accursed voice singing "God Save the King," full 20 minutes after they had all taken cover around the hut. By that time the 4 fugitives must have reached the creek and got into the boat, and the nearest creek was more than a mile from the hut. Where had that daring singer got to? Unless Satan himself had lent him wings, he could not have covered that mile on a rocky cliff in the space of 2 minutes. And only 2 minutes had elapsed between his song and the sound of the boat's oars away at sea. He must have remained behind, and was even now hiding somewhere about the cliffs. The patrols were still about. He would still be sighted, no doubt. Chauvelin felt hopeful once again. 1 or 2 of the men who had run after the fugitives were now slowly working their way up the cliff. One of them reached Chauvelin's side at the very moment that his hope arose in the astute diplomatist's heart. "We were too late, citoyenne," the soldier said. "We reached the beach just before the moon was hidden by the bank of clouds." The boat had undoubtedly been on the lookout behind that first creek a mile off. She had shoved off some time ago when we got to the beach and was already some way out to sea. We fired after her, but of course it was no good. She was making straight and quickly for the schooner. We saw her very clearly in the moonlight. "Yes," said Chauvelin with eager impatience. "She had shoved off some time ago, you said, and the nearest creek is a mile further on." "Yes, citoyen, I ran all the way straight to the beach, though I guessed the boat would have waited somewhere near the creek, as the tide would reach their earliest. The boat must have shoved off some minutes before the woman began to scream." Some minutes before the woman began to scream. Then Chauvelin's hopes had not deceived him. The Scarlet Pimpernel may have contrived to send the fugitives on ahead by the boat, but he himself had not had time to reach it. He was still on shore, and all the roads were well patrolled. At any rate, all was not yet lost, and would not be, whilst the impudent Britisher was still on French soil. "Bring the light in here," he commanded eagerly, as he once more entered the hut. The sergeant brought his lantern, and together the 2 men explored the little place. With a rapid glance, Chauvelin noticed its contents. The cauldron placed close under an aperture in the wall, and containing the last few dying embers of burned charcoal. A couple of stools, overturned as if in the haste of sudden departure. Then the fisherman's tools and his nets lying in one corner, and beside them something small and white. "Pick that up," said Chauvelin to the sergeant, pointing to his white scrap, "and bring it to me." It was a crumpled piece of paper, evidently forgotten there by the fugitives in their hurry to get away. The sergeant, much awed by the citoyenne's obvious rage and impatience, picked the paper up and handed it respectfully to Chauvelin. "Read it, sergeant," said the latter curtly. "It is almost illegible, citoyenne. A fearful scrawl." "I ordered you to read it," repeated Chauvelin viciously. The sergeant, by the light of his lantern, began deciphering the few hasty scrawled words. "I cannot quite reach you without risking your lives and endangering the success of your rescue. When you receive this, wait 2 minutes, then creep out of the hut one by one, turn to your left sharply, and creep cautiously down the cliff. Keep to the left all the time, till you reach the first rock, which you see jutting out far out to sea. Behind it in the creek the boat is on the lookout for you. Give a long, sharp whistle. She will come up. Get into her. My men will row you to the schooner, and thence to England and safety. Once on board the Daydream, send the boat back for me. Tell my men that I shall be at the creek, which is in the direct line opposite the Chagris, near Calais. They know it. I shall be there as soon as possible. They must wait for me at a safe distance out to sea, till they hear the usual signal. Do not delay, and obey these instructions implicitly." "Then there is the signature, citoyenne," added the sergeant as he handed the paper back to Chauvelin. But the latter had not waited an instant. One phrase of the momentous scrawl had caught his ear. "I shall be at the creek, which is in a direct line opposite the Chagris, near Calais." That phrase might yet mean victory for him. "Which of you knows this coast well?" he shouted to his men, who now, one by one, had all returned from their fruitless run, and were all assembled once more round the boat. "I do, citoyenne," said one of them. "I was born in Calais, and know every stone of these cliffs." "There is a creek in a direct line from the Chagris." "There is, citoyenne, I know it well." "The Englishman is hoping to reach that creek. He does not know every stone of these cliffs. He may go there by the longest way round, and in any case he will proceed cautiously for fear of the patrols. At any rate, there is a chance to get him yet. 1,000 francs to each man who gets to that creek before that long-legged Englishman." "I know a short-cut across the cliffs," said the soldier with an enthusiastic shout. He rushed over, followed closely by his comrades. Within a few minutes their running footsteps had died away in the distance. Chauvelin listened to them for a moment. The promise of the reward was lending spurs to the soldiers of the Republic. The gleam of hate and anticipated triumph was once more apparent on his face. Close to him, Desgas still stood mute and impassive, waiting for further orders, whilst 2 soldiers were kneeling beside the prostrate form of Marguerite. Chauvelin gave his secretary a vicious look. His well-laid plan had failed. Its sequel was problematic. There was still a great chance now that the Scarlet Pimpernel might yet escape, and Chauvelin, with that unreasoning fury which sometimes assails a strong nature, was longing to vent his rage on somebody. The soldiers were holding Marguerite pinioned to the ground, though she, poor soul, was not making the faintest struggle. Overwrought nature had at last peremptorily asserted herself, and she lay there in a dead swoon, her eyes circled by deep purple lines that told of long sleepless nights, her hair matted and damp round her forehead, her lips parted in a sharp curve that spoke of physical pain. The cleverest woman in Europe, the elegant and fashionable Lady Blakeney, who had dazzled London society with her beauty, her wit, and her extravagances, presented a very pathetic picture of tired-out, suffering womanhood, which would have appealed to any but the hard, vengeful heart of her baffled enemy. "It is no use mounting guards over a woman who is half dead," he said spitefully to his soldiers, "when you have allowed 5 men who are very much alive to escape." Obediently the soldiers rose to their feet. "You'd better try to find that footpath again for me, and that broken-down cart we left on the road." Then suddenly a bright idea seemed to strike him. "Ah, by the by, where is the merchant?" "Close by here, citoyenne," said Desgas. I gagged him and tied his legs together as you commanded." From the immediate vicinity, a plaintive moan reached Chauvelin's ears. He followed his secretary, who led the way to the other side of the hut, where, fallen into an absolute heap of dejection, with his legs tightly pinioned together and his mouth gagged, lay the unfortunate merchant. His face in the silvery light of the moon looked positively ghastly with terror. His eyes were wide open and almost glassy, and his whole body was trembling as if with ague, while a piteous wail escaped his bloodless lips. The rope, which had originally been wound round his shoulder and arms, had evidently given way, for it lay in a tangle about his body, but he seemed quite unconscious for this, for he had not made the slightest attempt to move from the place where Desgas had originally put him, like a terrified chicken which looks upon a line of white chalk drawn on a table, as on a string which paralyzes its movements. "Bring the cowardly brute here," commanded Chauvelin. He certainly felt exceedingly vicious, and since he had no reasonable grounds for venting his ill humor on the soldiers who had but too punctually obeyed his orders, he felt that the merchant would prove an excellent brute, with true French contempt, which has survived. Okay, we're skipping over parts. Yeah. I suppose now you have a good memory for bargains? Answer, he again commanded, as the merchant with trembling lips seemed too frightened to speak. "Yes, your honor," stammered the poor wretch. "You remember, then, the one you and I made together in Calais, when you undertook to overtake Reuben Goldstein, his nag, and my friend the tall stranger, eh? But, your honor—" "There was no but. I said, do you remember?" Yes, your honor." "What was the bargain?" There was dead silence. The unfortunate man looked round at the great cliffs, the moon above, the stolid faces of the soldiers, and even at the poor prostrate, inanimate woman close by, but said nothing. "Will you speak?" thundered Chauvelin menacingly. He did try, poor wretch, but obviously he could not. There was no doubt, however, that he knew what to expect from the stern man before him. "Your honor," he ventured imploringly. "Since your terror seems to have paralyzed your tongue," said Chauvelin sarcastically, "I must needs refresh your memory. It was agreed between us that if we overtook my friend the tall stranger before he reached this place, you were to have 10 gold pieces." A low moan escaped from the merchant's trembling lips. "But," added Chauvelin with a slow emphasis, "if you deceived me in your promise, you were to have a sound beating, and that would teach you to not tell lies." "I did not, your honor, I swear, and by all the other patriarchs I know. Unfortunately, they are still in Hades, I believe, according to your creed, and cannot help you much in your present trouble. Now, you did not fulfill your share of the bargain, but I am ready to fulfill mine. Here," he added to the soldiers, "the buckle end of your two belts to this confounded merchant." As the soldiers obediently unbuckled their heavy leather belts, the merchant set up a howl that surely would have been enough to bring all the patriarchs out of Hades and elsewhere to defend the merchant from the brutality of this French official. "I think I can rely on you, citoyen soldiers," laughed Chauvelin maliciously, "to give this old liar the best and soundest beating he has ever experienced. Don't kill him," he added dryly. "You will obey, citoyen," replied the soldiers as imperturbably as ever. He did not wait to see the orders carried out. He knew that he could trust these soldiers, who were still smarting under his rebuke, not to mince matters, when given a free hand to belabor a third party. "And that lumbering coward has had his punishment," he said to Desgas. "The men can guide us as far as the cart, and one of them can drive us in it back to Calais. The merchant and the woman can look after each other," he added roughly, "until we can send somebody for them in the morning. They can't run away very far in this present condition, and we cannot be troubled with them just now." Chauvelin had not given up all hope. His men, he knew, were spurred on by the hope of the reward. That enigmatic and audacious Scarlet Pimpernel, alone and with 30 men at his heels, could not reasonably be expected to escape a second time. But he felt less sure now. The Englishman's audacity had baffled him once, whilst the wooden-headed stupidity of the soldiers and the interference of a woman had turned his hand, which held all the trumps, into a losing one. If Marguerite had not taken up his time, if the soldiers had had a grain of intelligence, if it was a long if, and Chauvelin stood for a moment quite still and enrolled 30-odd people in one long, overwhelming anathema. Nature, poetic, silent, balmy, the bright moon, the calm, silvery sea spoke of beauty and of rest, and Chauvelin cursed nature, cursed a man and woman, and above all he cursed all long-legged, meddlesome British enigmas with one gigantic curse. The howls of the merchant behind him, undergoing his punishment, set a balm through his heart, overburdened as it was with a revengeful malice. He smiled. It eased his mind to think that some human being at last was, like himself, not altogether at peace with mankind. He turned and took a last look at the lonely bit of coast where stood the wooden hut, now bathed in moonlight, the scene of the greatest discomfiture ever experienced by a leading member of the Committee of Public Safety. Against a rock on a hard bed of stone lay the unconscious figure of Marguerite Blakeney, while some few paces further on the unfortunate merchant was receiving on his broad back the blows of 2 stout leather belts, wielded by the stolid arms of 2 sturdy soldiers of Republic. The howls of Benjamin Rosenbaum were fit to make the dead rise from their grave. They must have wakened all the gulls from their sleep, and from them looked down with great interest at the doings of the lords of the creation. "That will do," commanded Chauvelin, as the merchant's moans became more feeble, and the poor wretch seemed to have fainted away. "We don't want to kill him." Obediently, the soldiers buckled on their belts, one of them viciously kicking the merchant to one side. "Leave him there," said Chauvelin, "and lead the way now quickly to the cart. I'll follow." He walked up to where Marguerite lay and looked down into her face. She had evidently recovered consciousness and was making feeble efforts to raise herself. Her large blue eyes were looking into the moonlit sea round her with a scared and terrified look. They rested with a mixture of horror and pity on the merchant, whose luckless fate and wild howls had been the first signs that struck her with her returning senses. Then she caught sight of Chauvelin in his neat dark clothes, which seemed hardly crumpled into this Then she caught sight of Chauvelin in his neat dark clothes, which seemed hardly crumpled after the stirring events of the last few hours. He was smiling sarcastically, and his pale eyes peered down at her with a look of intense malice. With mock gallantry he stood and raised her icy cold hand to his lips, which sent a thrill of indescribable loathing within Marguerite's weary frame. "I much regret, fair lady," he said in his most suave tones, "that circumstances over which I have no control compelled me to leave you here for the moment, but I go away secure in the knowledge that I do not leave you unprotected. Our friend Benjamin here, though a trifle the worse for wear at the present moment, will prove a gallant defender of your fair person, I have no doubt. At dawn I will send an escort for you. Until then, I feel sure that you will find him devoted, though perhaps a trifle slow." Marguerite only had the strength to turn her head away. Her heart was broken with cruel anguish. One awful thought had returned to her mind, although with gathering consciousness. What had become of Percy? What of Armand? She knew nothing of what had happened after she heard the cheerful sound God save the king, which she believed to be the signal of death. I myself, concluded Chauvelin, must now very reluctantly leave you. Au revoir, fair lady. We meet, I hope, soon in London. Shall I see you at the Prince of Wales' garden party? No? Oh, well. Au revoir. Remember me, I pray, to Sir Percy Blakeney. And with a last ironical smile and bow, he once more kissed her hand and disappeared down the footpath in the wake of the soldiers and followed by the imperturbable Desgas. Chapter 31. The Escape. Marguerite listened, half dazed as she was, to the fast retreating, firm footsteps of the four men. All nature was so still that she, lying with her ear close to the ground, could distinctly trace the sounds of their tread, as they ultimately turned into the road, and presently the faint echo of the old cart wheels, the halting gait of the lean nag, told her that her enemy was a quarter of a league away. How long she lay there she knew not. She had lost count of time. Dreamily she looked up at the moonlit sky and listened to the monotonous roll of the waves. The invigorating scent of the sea was nectar to her wearied body. The immensity of the lonely cliffs was silent and dreamlike. Her brain only remained conscious of its ceaseless, its intolerable torture of uncertainty. She did not know. She did not know whether Percy was even now, at this moment, in the hands of the soldiers of the Republic, enduring, as she had done herself, the gibes and jeers of the malicious enemy. She did not know, on the other hand, whether Armand's lifeless body did not lie there in the hut, whilst Percy had escaped, only to hear that his wife's hands had guided the human bloodhounds to the murder of Armand and his friends. The physical pain of utter weariness was so great that she hoped confidently her tired body would rest here forever after all the turmoil, the passion, the intrigues of the last few days. Here, beneath that clear sky, within a sound of the sea, and with this balmy autumn breeze, whispered to her a last lullaby. All was so solitary, so silent, like unto dreamland. Oh, sorry about that. Like unto dreamland. Even the last faint echo of the distant cart had long ago died away afar. Suddenly, a sound, the strangest undoubtedly that these lonely cliffs of France had ever heard, broke the silent solemnity of the shore. So strange a sound was it that the gentle breeze ceased to murmur, the tiny pebbles to roll down the steep incline. So strange that Marguerite, wearied, overwrought as she was, thought that the beneficial unconsciousness of the approach of death was playing her half-sleeping senses a weird and elusive trick. It was the sound of a good, solid, absolutely British damn. The seagulls in their nests awoke and looked round in astonishment. A distant and solitary owl set up a midnight hoot. The tall cliffs frowned down majestically at the strange, unheard-of sacrilege. Marguerite did not trust her ears. Half raising herself on her hands, she strained every sense to see or hear, to know the meaning of this very earthly sound. All was still again for the space of a few seconds. The same silence once more fell upon the great and lonely vastness. Then Marguerite, who was listening as in a trance, who felt she must be dreaming with that cool, magnetic moonlight overhead, heard again, and this time her heart stood still, her eyes large and dilated, looked round her, not daring to trust to her other sense. Odds life, but I wish those damned fellows had not hit quite so hard. This time it was quite unmistakable. Only one particular pair of essentially British lips could have uttered those words in sleepy, drolly, affected tones. Damn, repeated those same British lips emphatically. Zounds, but I'm as weak as a rat. In a moment, Marguerite was on her feet. Was she dreaming? Were those great stony cliffs the gates of paradise? Was the fragrant breath of the breeze suddenly caused by the flutter of angels' wings, bringing tidings of unearthly joys to her after all her sufferings? Or, faint and ill, was she the prey of delirium? She listened again, and once again she heard the same very earthly sounds of good, honest British language, not the least akin to whispering from paradise or flutter of angels' wings. She looked round her eagerly at the tall cliffs, the lonely hut, the great stretch of rocky beach. Somewhere there, above or below her, behind a boulder or inside a crevice, but still hidden from her long, feverish eyes, must be the owner of that voice which once used to irritate her, but which now would make her the happiest woman in Europe, if only she could locate it. "Percy! Percy!" she shrieked hysterically, tortured between doubt and hope. "I'm here. Come to me. Where are you? Percy! Percy!" "Oh, it's all very well calling me, my dear," said the same sleepy, drawly voice. "That's odd life. I cannot come to you. Those damned frog-eaters have trussed me like a goose in a spit, and I'm as weak as a mouse. I cannot get away." And still Marguerite did not understand. She did not realize for at least another 10 seconds whence came that voice, so drawly, so dear, but alas, with a strange accent of weakness and of suffering. There was no one within sight except by that rock. Great God, the merchant! Was she mad or dreaming? His back was against the pale moonlight. He was half crouching, trying vainly to raise himself with his arms tightly pinioned. Marguerite ran up to him, took his head in both her hands, and looked straight into a pair of blue eyes, good-natured, even a trifle amused, shining out of the weird and distorted mask of the merchant. "Percy! Percy! My husband!" she gasped, faint with the fullness of her joy. "Thank God! Thank God!" "Law, my dear," he rejoined good-humoredly, "we will both do that anon. And you think you can loosen these damned ropes, release me from my inelegant attitude?" She had no knife. Her fingers were numb and weak, but she worked away with her teeth, while great welcome tears poured from her eyes onto those poor pinioned hands. "Odd's life," he said, when at last, after frantic efforts on her part, the rope seemed at last to be giving away. "But I marvel whether it has ever happened before that an English gentleman allowed himself to be licked by a damned foreigner, and made no attempt to give as good as he got." It was very obvious that he was exhausted from sheer physical pain, and when at last the rope gave way, he fell in a heap against the rock. Marguerite looked helplessly round her. "Oh, for a drop of water on this awful beach," she cried in agony, seeing that he was ready to faint again. "Nay, my dear," he murmured with his good-humoured smile. "Personally, I should prefer a drop of good French brandy, and you'll drive in the pocket of this dirty old garment. You'll find my flask. I'm damned if I can move." When he had drunk some brandy, he forced Marguerite to do likewise. "Law, that's better now, eh, little woman?" he said with a sigh of satisfaction. "Hi-ho! But this is a queer rig-up for Sir Percy Blakeney, Bart, to be found in by his lady, and no mistake. Begad," he added, passing his hand over his chin, "haven't been shaved for nearly 20 hours. I must look a disgusting object. As for these girls—" And laughingly he took off the disfiguring wig and curls, and stretched out his long limbs, which were cramped from many hours stooping. Then he bent forward and looked long and searchingly into his wife's blue eyes. "Percy," she whispered, with a deep blush suffused her delicate cheeks and neck. "If you only knew—" "I do know, dear, everything," he said with infinite gentleness. "And can you ever forgive me?" "I have not to forgive, sweetheart. Your heroism, your devotion, which I, alas, so little deserved, have more than atoned for that unfortunate episode at the ball." Then you knew? She whispered. All the time? Yes, he replied tenderly. I knew, all the time. But begad, had I but known what a noble heart yours was, my Margot, I should have trusted you as you deserved to be trusted, and you would not have had to undergo the terrible sufferings of the past few hours in order to run after a husband who has done so much that needs forgiveness. They were sitting side by side, leaning up against a rock, and he had rested his aching head on her shoulder. She certainly now deserved a name of the happiest woman in Europe. It is a case of the blind leading the lame, sweetheart, is it not? He said with his good-natured smile of old. Odds life, but I do not know which are the more sore, my shoulders or your little feet. He bent forward to kiss them, for they peeped out through her torn stockings and bore pathetic witness to her endurance and devotion. But Armand, she said with sudden terror and remorse, as in the midst of her happiness the image of the beloved brother, for whose sake she had so deeply sinned, rose now before her mind. Oh, they have no fear for Armand, sweetheart, he said tenderly. Did I not pledge you my word that he should be safe? He with de Tournay and the others are even now on board the Daydream. But how? She gasped. I do not understand. Yet 'tis simple enough, my dear, he said, with that funny, half-shy, half-inane laugh of his. You see, when I found that brute Chauvelin meant to stick to me like a leech, I thought the best thing I could do, as I could not shake him off, was to take him along with me. I had to get to Armand and the others somehow, and all the roads were patrolled, and every one on the lookout for your humble servant. I knew that when I slipped through Chauvelin's fingers at the Chagris, that he would lie in wait for me here, whichever way I took. I wanted to keep an eye on him and his doings, and a British head is as good as a French one any day. Indeed, it had proved to be infinitely better, and Marguerite's heart was filled with joy and marvel as he continued to recount to her the daring manner in which he had snatched the fugitives away right from under Chauvelin's very nose. Dressed as the dirty merchant, he said gaily, I knew I should not be recognized. I had met Reuben Goldstein in Calais earlier in the evening. For a few gold pieces he supplied me with his rig-out and undertook to bury himself out of sight of everybody, whilst he lent me his cart and nag. But if Chauvelin had discovered you, she gasped excitedly. Your disguise was good, but he's so sharp. Odds fish, he rejoined quietly. Then certainly the game would have been up. I could not take the risk. I could but take the risk. I know human nature pretty well by now, he added with a note of sadness in his cheery young voice. And I know these Frenchmen out and out. They so loathe a merchant that they never come nearer than a couple of yards of him, and begad, I fancy that I contrive to make myself look about as loathsome an object as it is possible to conceive. Yes, and then, she asked eagerly, Zeus, then I carried out my little plan. That is to say, at first I only determined to leave everything to chance, but when I heard Chauvelin giving his orders to the soldiers, I thought the fate and I were going to work together after all. I reckoned on the blind obedience of the soldiers. Chauvelin had ordered them on pain of death not to stir until the tall Englishman came. Desgas had thrown me down in a heap quite close to the hut. Soldiers took no notice of the merchant who had driven Citoyen Chauvelin to this spot. I managed to free my hands from the ropes with which the brute had trussed me. I always carry pencil and paper with me wherever I go, and I hastily scrawled a few important instructions on a scrap of paper. Then I looked about me. I crawled up to the hut under the very noses of the soldiers, who lay under cover without stirring, just as Chauvelin had ordered them to do. Then I dropped my note into the hut, through a chink in the wall, and waited. In this note I told the fugitives to walk noiselessly out of the hut, creep down the cliffs, keep to the left until they came to the first creek, to give a certain signal,
Then the boat of the Daydream, which lay in wait not far out to sea, would pick them up. They obeyed implicitly, fortunately for them and for me. The soldiers who saw them were equally obedient to Chauvelin's orders. They did not stir. I waited for nearly half an hour. When I knew that the fugitives were safe, I gave the signal which caused so much stir. And that was the whole story. It seemed so simple, and Marguerite could but marvel at the wonderful ingenuity, the boundless pluck and audacity which had evolved and helped to carry out his daring plan. "But those brutes struck you!" she gasped in horror at the bare recollection of the fearful indignity. "Well, that cannot be helped," he said gently. "Whilst my little wife's fate was so uncertain, I had to remain here by her side. That's life," he added merrily. "Never fear, Chauvelin will lose nothing by waiting, I warrant. Wait till I get him back to England. La! You shall pay for the thrashing he gave me with compound interest, I promise you." Marguerite laughed. It was so good to be beside him, to hear his cheery voice, to watch that good-humored twinkle in his blue eyes as he stretched out his strong arms in longing for that foe in anticipation of his well-deserved punishment. Suddenly, however, he started. The happy blush left her cheeks. The light of joy died out of her eyes. She had heard a stealthy footfall overhead, and a stone had rolled down from the top of the cliffs right down to the beach below. "What's that?" she whispered in horror and alarm. "Oh, nothing, my dear," he muttered with a pleasant laugh. "Only a trifle you happen to have forgotten, my friend Fawkes." "Sir Andrew!" she gasped. Indeed, she had wholly forgotten the devoted friend and companion who had trusted and stood by her during all these hours of anxiety and suffering. She remembered him now tardily and with a pang of remorse. "Ah, you had forgotten him, hadn't you, my dear?" said Sir Percy merrily. "Fortunately, I met him not far from the Chagris before I had that interesting supper party with my friend Chauvelin. Odds life, but I have a score to settle with that young reprobate. But in the meanwhile, I told him a very long, very roundabout road, that which would bring him here by a very circuitous road, which Chauvelin's men would never suspect, just about the time when we are ready for him, eh, little woman?" "And he obeyed?" asked Marguerite in utter astonishment. "Without word or question. See, here he comes. He was not in the way when I did not want him, and now he arrives in the nick of time. Ah, he will make pretty little Susanna most admirable and methodical husband." In the meanwhile, Sir Andrew Fawkes had cautiously worked his way down the cliffs. He stopped once or twice, pausing to listen for the whispered words which would guide him to Blakeney's hiding place. "Blakeney?" he ventured to say at last cautiously. "Blakeney, are you there?" The next moment he rounded the rocks again, which Sir Percy and Marguerite were leaning, and seeing the weird figure still clad in the long merchant's gabardine, he paused in sudden, complete bewilderment. But already Blakeney had struggled to his feet. "Here I am, friend," he said with his funny, inane laugh, "all alive, though I do look a begad scarecrow in these damned things." "Zooks!" ejaculated Sir Andrew in boundless astonishment as he recognized his leader. Of all the young man had seen Marguerite and happily checked the forcible language that rose to his lips at the sight of the exquisite Sir Percy in his weird and dirty garb. "Yes," said Blakeney calmly, "of all the... My friend, I have not yet had time to ask you what you were doing in France when I ordered you to remain in London. Insubordination, what? Wait till my shoulders are less sore, and by gad, see the punishment you'll get." "Hot's fish, I'll bear it," said Sir Andrew with a merry laugh, "seeing that you are alive to give it. Would you have had me allow Lady Blakeney to do the journey alone? But in the name of heaven, man, where did you get these extraordinary clothes?" "Lud, they are a bit quaint, aren't they?" Sir Percy laughed jovially. But odds fish, he added with sudden earnestness and authority. Now you are here, folks, we must lose no more time. That brute Chauvelin may send someone to look after us. Marguerite was so happy she could have stayed here forever, hearing his voice, asking 100 questions, but at mention of Chauvelin's name, she started in quick alarm, afraid for the dear life she would have died to save. "But how can we get back?" she gasped. "The roads are full of soldiers between here and Calais, and we are not going back to Calais, sweetheart," he said, "but just the other side of the Gris, not half a league from here. The boat of the Daydream will meet us there." "The boat of the Daydream?" "Yes," he said with a merry laugh, "another little trick of mine. I should have told you before that when I slipped that note into the hut I had also added another for Armand, which I directed him to leave behind, and which has sent Chauvelin and his men running full tilt back to the Chagris after me. But the first little note contained my real instructions, including those to old Briggs. He had my orders to go out further to sea, and then towards the west. When well out of sight of Calais, he will send the galley to a little creek he and I know of, just beyond Chagris. The men will look out for me. We have a preconcerted signal, and we will all be safely aboard, whilst Chauvelin and his men solemnly sit and watch the creek, which is just opposite the Chagris." "The other side of the Chagris? But I cannot walk, Percy," she moaned helplessly, as, trying to struggle to her tired feet, she found herself unable to even to stand. "I will carry you, dear," he said simply. "The blind leading the lame, you know." Sir Percy was ready, too, to help with the precious burden. But Sir Andrew was ready, too, to help with the precious burden, but Sir Percy would not entrust his beloved to any arms but his own. "When you and she are both safely on board the Daydream," he said to his young comrade, "and I feel that Mademoiselle Suzanne's eyes will not greet me in England with reproachful looks, then it will be my turn to rest." And his arms, still vigorous in spite of fatigue and suffering, closed round Marguerite's poor, weary body and lifted her as gently as if she had been a feather. Then, as Sir Andrew discreetly kept out of earshot, there were many things said, or rather whispered, which even the autumn breeze did not catch, for it had gone to rest. All his fatigue was forgotten. His shoulders must have been very sore, for the soldiers had hit hard, but the man's muscles seemed made of steel, and his energy was almost supernatural. It was a weary tramp, half a league along the stony side of the cliffs, but never for a moment did his courage give way or his muscles yield to fatigue. On he tramped with firm footstep, his vigorous arms encircling the precious burden, and no doubt as she lay, quiet and happy, in times lulled to momentary drowsiness, at others watching, through the slowly gathering morning light, the pleasant face with the lazy, drooping blue eyes, ever cheerful, ever illumined with a good-humored smile, she whispered many things which helped to shorten the weary road, and acted as a soothing balsam to his aching sinews. The many-hued light of dawn was breaking in the east, when at last they reached the creek beyond Gris. The galley lay in wait. In answer to a signal from Sir Percy, she drew near, and 2 sturdy British sailors had the honor of carrying my lady into the boat. Half an hour later they were on board the Daydream. The crew, who of necessity were in their master's secrets, and who were devoted to him heart and soul, were not surprised to see him arrive in so extraordinary a disguise. Armand St-Just and the other fugitives were eagerly awaiting the advent of their brave rescuer. He would not stay to hear the expressions of their gratitude, but found the way to his private cabin as quickly as he could, leaving Marguerite quite happy in the arms of her brother. Everything on board the Daydream was fitted with that exquisite luxury so dear to Sir Percy Blakeney's heart, and by the time they had all landed at Dover, he had found time to get into some of the sumptuous clothes which he loved, and of which he always kept a supply on board his yacht. The difficulty was to provide Marguerite with a pair of shoes, and great was the little middy's joy when my lady found that she could put foot on English shore in his best pair. The rest is silence. Silence and joy for those who had endured so much suffering, yet found at last a great and lasting happiness. But it is on record that at the brilliant wedding of Sir Andrew Ffoulkes Bart with Mademoiselle Suzanne de Tournay de Basserive, a function at which H.R.H., the Prince of His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, and all the elite of fashionable society were present, the most beautiful woman there was unquestionably Lady Blakeney, whilst the clothes Sir Percy wore were the talk of the Jeunesse Dorée of London for many, that's the youth of the day? I don't know. Of London for many days. It is also a fact that Monsieur Chauvelin, the accredited agent of the French Republic government, was not present at that or any other social functions in London after that memorable evening at Lord Grenville's ball. All right, and that is the conclusion of the Scarlet Pimpernel. And actually, the timing is perfect. We're just a tiny bit past 4. So I'm going to end the Storytime stream here, just to, to make it a nice little compact package for YouTube. I'm going to take a tiny break. Feel free to take a little break yourself. Then I'm going to come back with a game stream. And I'm really quickly going to see if, let's see. Okay, Josu is not on. I was going to play Eichenfell, but I may do some RuneScape instead. Just do a little. I think there is like an introductory quest to introduce the dungeoneering. So I'll do that, and maybe a few other like super begin. I also need to do the quest to start rune crafting. So I think I will do those. Yeah, thank you so much for hanging out with me, UK. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Yeah. And if you'll be sticking around, hang on a second. If you'll be sticking around, I'll see you in a few minutes for the game stream. If not, I will see you next time. And just a reminder of the upcoming streams. Sunday, we're going to be starting Northanger Abbey at 2 o'clock Pacific time. Monday is going to be the Streamiversary stream, where we'll be playing RuneScape with anybody who wishes to join. And yeah, next week is going to be another Wednesday story time. So I will see you in a few moments. Bye.